$50 got you through the door at Ironworks Gym on a Friday night in February. $5,000 went to anyone who could last 3 minutes with Brody Kessler. 25 years old, undefeated, a sponsorship deal, a camera crew that followed him everywhere, and a mouth that hadn't cost him a thing in his whole life. That night he wasn't looking for a fighter. He was looking for a laugh. He found it in the corner, where a janitor in a gray work shirt was pushing a mop across the rubber floor. Big man, early 30s, quiet, the kind of quiet folks mistake for empty. Nobody in that room knew his last name. Nobody had ever bothered to ask. Brody looked at the mop, looked at the cheap work boots, and grinned at his camera. "Easy money," he said. 200 people laughed along with him. The janitor didn't. He leaned the mop against the wall, crouched down, and started unlacing his boots. He set them side by side outside the mat, lined up neat, the way a man does when he's stepping into somebody else's home. Then he said 6 words that dropped the whole room into silence. Brody took the bet on a live stream, in front of 200 witnesses, and every last one of them was certain they knew exactly how the next 3 minutes would go. They were all wrong, because the man in the gray work shirt hadn't taken that job for the paycheck, and the name stitched above his pocket wasn't the name he was born with. 3 minutes later, nobody in that gym was laughing, and the ones who found out who he really was would spend the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. If a story like this moves you, hit that like button. It really does help. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you won't miss what we bring you next. Now let's go back to the beginning. 3 months before that Friday night, to a man nobody ever looked at twice. 3 months before that Friday night, in the private dining room tucked behind an Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia, 4 older men sat around a long table covered with a white cloth, and not one of them touched the plate of food set before him. The food had gone cold long ago. The waiter had poured water once, then stepped outside and closed the wooden door behind him, and from that moment on, no one called him back in. The only sounds left in the room were the faint rattle of the heater on the wall and the soft tap of a silver spoon against the edge of a plate as Sal Renzo shifted in his chair for the 3rd time. Sal was the only man at the table who reached up every few minutes to adjust his collar. The other 3 sat as still as statues, because they knew exactly what was coming, and they had lived long enough in this line of work to understand that in rooms like this, the man who moved the most was the man who was about to answer for something. The door opened. Nico Ferrante entered without making any sound worth noticing, took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, then sat down at the head of the table. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't need to. The 4 other men, all of them older than he was, some of whom had been walking these streets since before he had learned to walk, straightened their backs at the same time, as though someone had just pulled an invisible string. Nico placed a leather-bound ledger with worn corners on the table, pushed it toward the center, then folded his arms. He didn't open the ledger. He simply left it lying there. "Those shops around the Wharton intersection," he said, his voice as calm as if he were talking about the weather. "Mrs. Aponte's laundromat, the shoe repair shop beside the church, the cafe owned by the Duarte brothers." Sal swallowed hard. No one at the table turned to look at him, and that was what made it frightening, because it meant the other 3 already knew. "I've been told that someone stops by every month," Nico continued. "Not one of my men. Not anyone on any list I've signed. Mrs. Aponte is somewhere in her 70s now, and her hands shake so badly she can't even count loose change. Yet every month, someone waits outside her shop on the 5th day." He paused. The heater gave a final rattle and shut off, and in the silence that followed, every breath Sal took could be heard with perfect clarity. "I'm not asking who did it," Nico said. "I already know." Sal opened his mouth. He began with Nico, then corrected himself to Mr. Ferrante, and in the very moment he had to change the way he addressed him. He confessed before he could even speak his second sentence. Nico raised one finger. Just one finger. Nothing more. Sal fell silent. "You have 2 paths," Nico said. "The first path, you give it back. Every last dollar. To every single shop. My men will go with you. They'll speak for you. All you have to do is stand there and nod. Once it's done, I'll never mention it again, and no one at this table will ever mention it again." Sal exhaled, his relief plain to see. He thought it was over. "The second path," Nico said. "You still return every last dollar, but you go alone. No one goes with you. No one speaks for you. You walk into Mrs. Aponte's laundromat in broad daylight, stand in front of her, and tell her yourself who you are and what you took from her. Then you go to the shoe repair shop. Then you go to the cafe. You keep doing it until you've reached every name on the list. No one in the room moved. Nico pushed the leather-bound ledger a little farther toward Sal. You choose. And what made the other three men lower their eyes to the cold plates before them was the moment Sal Renzo, a man who had spent almost his entire life in this line of work, suddenly understood that the second choice was far more terrifying than the first. Not because it was dangerous, but because it would force him to look directly into the faces of the people whose money he had taken, and hear himself say aloud what he had done. Sal's face turned gray. He nodded, a very small nod, before he finally managed to speak. The first path. Good, Nico replied. Then he stood, picked up his coat, and said, Tomorrow morning, we start with Mrs. Aponte. He left the room, walked down the narrow hallway, filled with the scent of garlic and olive oil, pushed open the back door, and stepped into the cold alley. A black car was waiting at the curb, its engine still running, its taillights casting 2 red streaks across the dirty snow. The driver got out and opened the door without saying a word, because in the past 3 years, he had never once needed to ask Nico Ferrante where he wanted to go. Inside the car, Nico didn't tell the driver to leave right away. He sat in silence for a while, slipped a hand into his coat pocket, and took out a piece of paper that had been folded into quarters so many times that the creases were nearly torn through. He opened it beneath the weak overhead light, though he didn't really need to look at it anymore. He had read it so many times that he could recite it in the dark. There was only a single handwritten line, written in a woman's hand, the letters trembling slightly near the end, with no greeting, no signature, and no return address. There are names buried beneath yours. You should go and find them yourself, because your people won't tell you. The note had arrived at his office inside a plain white envelope, with no company mark and no postmark that could help him trace where it had come from. It had been buried among a stack of meeting invitations and utility bills, and if he hadn't opened all the mail himself that day, a habit he had kept since his brother died, it might have been thrown away with the rest of the scrap paper. He had read it 3 times in a row at his desk, then called Aldo Marchetti upstairs. Aldo was the only person left in the world who still called him by the name his mother had given him. The man who had held him in his arms before he could speak, the man who had stood behind him in the church at Sandro's funeral, and steadied him by the shoulder when his legs faltered. Nico handed him the note. Aldo read it slowly, then gave it back. Just some idle person's idea of a joke, he said. Nico said that was possible. Then he asked for one thing: every workplace accident record from every branch of every company bearing the Ferrante name, from the day he signed the papers taking control until the present day. The following week, Aldo brought him a thick file, carefully bound, complete with a table of contents and signed certifications from every division. Nico read all of it over the course of 2 consecutive nights. It was clean. It was complete. Every case had a report, a compensation record, the signatures of both parties, and dates that matched down to the smallest detail. And that very cleanliness was what made him sit up in the middle of the night, switch on his desk lamp, take out paper and pencil, and compare the records against the number of construction contracts those branches had handled during the same period. He made a very rough calculation, the kind of calculation his father had taught him in the gym years ago. With that many construction sites, that much scaffolding, and that many men climbing up and down every day, the number in that file was simply too perfect. So perfect that it couldn't possibly be real. He remained there until nearly dawn, and at last he wrote a number on a sheet of scrap paper. 9. At least 9 cases should have been in that file, yet weren't. 9 names belonging to people he didn't know, people who might be alive or dead, people whose families might now be living lives he couldn't even imagine. And he had no way to prove any of it, because the only thing in his hands was a calculation written in pencil on scrap paper, while the thing sitting on the lawyer's desk was an officially stamped file. The next morning, he told Aldo that he would go himself. He wouldn't send men down to investigate, and he wouldn't call for an internal inspection. He would go in person, visit each facility one by one, work the night shift, and stand inside the very buildings that carried his name, so he could see what that name had done while he wasn't watching. Aldo objected. He didn't raise his voice, because he had never raised his voice at Nico, but he spoke longer than usual, and he repeated his point 3 times in 3 different ways. He told him that he was the man in charge, and the man in charge didn't do the work of hired hands. He told him there were countless eyes outside, waiting for him to make one misstep. He told him to give him the list, that he would have his own people examine it again, that he would investigate more thoroughly and work more quickly, and that Nico didn't need to walk into those places himself. Nico watched him for a moment, then shook his head. If someone has already cleaned up the paperwork, he said, then it won't matter what list you give them. Aldo fell silent. He stood, fastened the button of his coat, and said that if Nico had already made up his mind, he wouldn't try to stop him anymore. The next morning, a perfectly ordinary application for a night shift position appeared on the desk of Otis Grady, the manager of Ironworks Gym. It was written by hand, in a slightly clumsy script, listed no experience worth mentioning, and bore the name Nick Farrow. A few blocks south of Ironworks Gym, in a third-floor apartment with no elevator, Corinne Bishop had been awake since before the sky had even begun to think about growing light. She stood in the kitchen holding the paper she had taken from the mailbox the previous afternoon, but hadn't found the courage to open until now. She read it once from beginning to end, then read it again more slowly, as though the words might become a little kinder the second time. They didn't. It was a notice from the landlord, written in language so polite it sent a chill through her, stating that if the outstanding balance wasn't paid by the deadline printed below, the lease would be terminated. When Corinne finished reading, she folded the paper and placed it face down on the table beneath the sugar jar, in the corner where a child of 6, who barely reached her waist, would never see it. Then she turned on the stove, heated some water, and began making oatmeal. The sound of bare feet pattered across the wooden floor, and Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair sticking straight up on one side and a drawing held in both hands. "Look, Mom," the little girl said, lifting the paper high above her head. "I drew the cat from yesterday's book." On the page was an orange animal as round as a pumpkin, with 6 whiskers of equal length and a tail almost as large as its entire body. Corinne bent down and studied it with great seriousness. "It's much too fat," she said. "That's because it ate all of Grandma's cake," Maisie replied matter-of-factly. "When Mrs. Halloran got to that part, I laughed so hard I choked, and she said I made her lose her place." Corinne laughed, a real laugh, the only real thing she would have that day. She used a magnet to fasten the picture to the refrigerator door, right in the easiest place to see, covering an old bill beneath it. Maisie climbed onto a chair, sat with her legs crossed, and ate her oatmeal with a spoon that was too big for her mouth. Halfway through the bowl, she looked up. "Will you be home early today?" Corinne was tying back her hair. Her hands paused for one very brief beat, so brief that the little girl didn't notice, and then she smiled. "I'll be home. Tonight, I'll finish reading that book to you, all the way to the part where the cat climbs onto the roof." "All the way to the roof," Corinne said. She put on her coat, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and told her to behave for Mrs. Halloran in the apartment across the hall. On her way down the stairs, she walked with a slight limp, placing her left foot half a beat more slowly than her right, a habit she had carried since the previous winter, when she took on a second shift and began spending more hours on her feet than an ordinary pair of legs could bear. She worked the morning shift at a diner on Passyunk Avenue, pouring coffee, carrying plates, wiping tables, and smiling at the regulars who called her sweetheart and left loose change on their saucers as tips. Near noon, she took off her apron, changed clothes in the employee restroom, and caught a bus to the hospital. The doctor saw her in a small room with a window overlooking the parking lot. She spoke slowly and clearly. The way people speak when they know the person sitting across from them will have to remember every word. She said the good news was that the little girl's name was on the schedule, the surgery date had been set, and the team was ready. Her heart needed to be repaired, and now she was no longer waiting outside. Her turn was coming. Then the doctor slid a printed cost breakdown across the desk, pointed to the final line, and explained that the insurance wouldn't cover that portion. Corinne looked at the figure on that line. She didn't need to do the math. She had been counting the figures in her head every night for months, counting the number of shifts at the diner together with the number of nighttime cleaning shifts, including the weeks when she didn't take a single day off. And she knew that even if she worked every remaining day of the year, she still couldn't reach the amount on that final line. "When is the deadline?" she asked. The doctor said 1 month. If that portion hadn't been secured by then, the hospital would have no choice but to give the slot to someone else who was waiting, and the little girl would return to the list and have to begin again from the bottom. Corinne nodded. She thanked the doctor, stood, stepped into the hallway, and sat down on a blue plastic chair attached to a long row of identical seats. She remained there for a very long time, People passed in front of her, carts rolled by, and someone called a doctor's name over the ceiling speaker. Then everything grew quiet again. She picked up the paper, folded it in half, then folded it in half once more, pressing her thumbnail firmly along the crease before slipping it into her coat pocket. Then she stood, walked to the exit, and caught the bus home in time to finish reading the book to her daughter. She didn't cry. 2 o'clock in the morning at Ironworks was an hour that belonged to no one. Only half the ceiling lights were on. The heater blew out dry air that smelled of rubber and bleach, and the 2 night shift workers moved back and forth through that silence, like 2 stewards guarding the hold of a ship already at anchor. Corinne began in the free weights area, while Nick started along the row of treadmills farther inside, and they met in the middle, where a puddle of water had been left by someone that afternoon who hadn't bothered to report it. She was bent over, scrubbing a long black streak from the rubber floor, when she noticed him stop to watch. "That won't come off with cleaning solution," she said without looking up. "It's tar. People walk in wearing their shoes from the parking lot, and when the tar meets the warm floor, it melts. No matter how much you scrub, you'll only spread it farther." Nick asked what he was supposed to do instead. Corinne stood, took a small bottle from the bottom compartment of her cart, poured a little onto a cloth, pressed it against the black mark, and held it there for a long while without scrubbing. "Wait," she said. "This is where people usually get it wrong. They think they have to scrub as hard as they can, and the harder they scrub, the cleaner it'll get. But you actually have to leave it alone and let it soak in first. If you scrub too soon, you'll ruin the entire section of flooring, and replacing even a single yard of this floor would cost half a week's pay for me." Then she pulled the cloth across the mark in one firm, decisive stroke, and the black streak disappeared. Nick looked at the clean floor, then at her, and thanked her in the way people do when someone has just taught them something genuinely useful. At around 3 o'clock, the vending machine in the hallway swallowed his money without giving him a cup. Corinne walked past, struck the side of the machine lightly in one particular spot, and a cup dropped out. "Night shift secret," she said. He paid for another cup, but the machine had run out, so the 2 of them shared the coffee, leaning against the hallway wall and drinking half each. It was weak and hot, and didn't taste good at all. But at that hour, it was the warmest thing in the building. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Not long." "What do you think?" "It's quiet," he said. Corinne nodded. "It is quiet, but pay attention sometime. Think about how many people come and go through this place during the day. At night, they all go home, and not one of them knows that someone comes in to clean the place where they were sitting. In the morning, they walk in, the floors are clean, the mirrors shine, the towels are neatly folded, and they think that's simply how things have always been. Once you do this kind of work, you understand that people only notice you when you make a mistake." Nick took a sip and handed the cup back to her. "You're right," he said, and she heard something in his voice that carried more weight than polite agreement, but she didn't ask. When they returned to the cart, he noticed the photograph taped to the inside panel, hidden from view. It was a small picture with curling edges, showing a little girl laughing so hard that both her eyes were squeezed shut. He looked at it a little longer. "Is that your daughter?" Corinne was turning the mop in the bucket. She paused for half a beat, the exact way she always paused whenever someone asked a question that came too close. "Yes," she said. "She looks happy," he said. "She is happy," Corinne replied. Then she lifted the mop from the bucket, wrung out the water, and continued in a completely different voice, the voice of someone who had just closed a door, very softly, so no one would hear it shut. "Remember to keep an eye on the faucet in the men's locker room. It leaks. If you don't close it tightly, an entire corner will be wet by morning, and then they'll say we were lazy." He didn't ask anything else. That was what she noticed about him that very night, that he was the first person in a very long time to ask her a question and know exactly where to stop. People usually didn't stop. They asked more. They asked where the girl's father was. They asked why Corinne had to work 2 shifts. They asked in a voice they believed sounded caring but was really only curious. And they always ended with some expression of pity she didn't need. She had never asked anyone for anything in her life. Her father used to say that the only thing no one could ever take from you was the way you stood. And she had remained true to that even on the nights when she sat on the edge of her bed, calculating the same numbers over and over again, and finding no answer. Near 4 o'clock in the morning, they switched off more of the lights and pushed both carts back into the storage room. At the door, he told her he hoped she could get a little sleep. She said there was no point in sleeping because she had to be at the diner by 6 o'clock. Then she laughed. And he laughed too. And they stepped outside into the cold, walking away in opposite directions, neither of them knowing who they had just been standing beside. Otis Grady's office stood at the end of the hallway, behind a frosted glass door with the word manager, written in decal lettering, that had lost one corner so long ago no one could remember when it happened. The room was just large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, a swivel chair that sagged badly to the left, and an old photograph hanging on the wall, showing a young man wearing boxing gloves as he stood in the center of a ring, one hand raised, his face bruised but his smile radiant. Otis rarely looked at that photograph anymore. He didn't often tell anyone that he had once fought in the ring either, because whenever he did, people asked how many bouts he had won, and the answer wasn't anything worth boasting about. That morning, he arrived earlier than usual, made coffee in a scaled electric pot, sat down, and turned on the computer screen. 2 old reports were still sitting in his sent folder, one from the fall and the other from before Christmas. Both had been sent to the Human Resources Department of the parent company, and both had been read, because the system displayed a read receipt, yet neither had received so much as a single line in reply. He opened the most recent one, and read it from beginning to end. He had written it very carefully at the time, without using a single harsh adjective, without making assumptions or offering personal opinions. He had recorded only the dates, the times, and what had happened. He wrote that a member had filmed the cleaning staff, without asking permission. He wrote that someone had made jokes about an employee's appearance and occupation in front of a crowd. He wrote that a young trainer had resigned after being turned into a joke online, and that the young man hadn't filed a complaint because he said it wouldn't make any difference. Otis remembered the day the young man returned his access card. He hadn't been angry. He had only shrugged, and that shrug had troubled Otis for months. The previous afternoon, Otis had been forced to stand by and watch yet another incident. Brody Kessler had come in to work out, bringing his cameraman with him as usual, and while he waited for a machine, he made several remarks to his friends about the woman cleaning the mirrors in the weights area. Corinne didn't turn around. She simply continued wiping the glass, slowly, neither faster nor slower than before, and it was that complete lack of reaction that made Otis feel his face burning as he stood behind the front desk. He had meant to step out. He had already thought of what he would say. Then he glanced toward Brody's sponsor, who was standing by the door with a phone in his hand, and Otis didn't move. He remained where he was, wiping a counter that was already clean, until they had gone. Now, seated in front of the screen, he opened a blank document and began typing his third report. He typed slowly with 2 fingers, stopping often to find exactly the right words. Halfway through, he stopped altogether, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the retirement documents that Human Resources had sent him at the beginning of the year. He turned to the page with the calculation table, studied the final line, and sat motionless for a long time. That was everything he had managed to save in his entire life. He had no house, no land, and no other savings. There was only that amount, and it was controlled by the very company that couldn't be bothered to answer him. He wasn't old enough to retire immediately, but he was already too old to go looking for work somewhere else. He knew they didn't have to fire him. All they had to do was reorganize his position, give his job a new title, move him down 1 level, and the amount on that calculation sheet would begin shrinking all by itself. He had seen it happen to others. It wasn't loud. No one raised a voice. There was only a brief meeting and a sheet of paper. Otis closed the drawer. He took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold, then finished typing the rest of the report. He didn't add anything about the 2 previous reports he had sent without receiving a reply. He didn't write that this would be the last time, either. He simply recorded the date, the time, and what had happened, exactly as he had done twice before. Then he read it again, corrected 1 comma, and moved the cursor over the send button. He sat that way for quite some time, his hand resting on the mouse, his fingertip refusing to press down. Beyond the office, he heard the front door open, someone exchanging a greeting, and a weight striking the floor. Otis looked at the old photograph on the wall, at the young man standing in the ring with his hand raised, then turned back to the screen and clicked send. A message appeared in his inbox, confirming that the report had been sent successfully. He switched off the monitor, stood, slipped his arms into his coat, and went outside to open the doors for the morning shift. Throughout that entire week, and all of the week that followed, no one replied. The bulletin board hung immediately to the left of the entrance, where everyone who walked in had to pass it, and it was always crowded with papers layered over one another, class schedules, advertisements for supplements, and business cards from independent trainers. Corinne's notice was in the bottom right corner, the least visible spot, because she had stood in front of that board for a very long time before putting it up, and had finally chosen the corner where she believed it would bother people the least. She had written it by hand, starting over 3 times on 3 different sheets, because each time she thought her handwriting looked too ugly. She didn't write much. She said that her daughter was waiting for her turn at the hospital, that the little girl's heart needed to be repaired, that she worked the night shift here, and that she would be grateful for any help anyone could give. She didn't write her daughter's name. She didn't attach a photograph. In one corner of the paper was a heart drawn in red crayon, its lines thick and uneven, made by the hand of a child of 6 on the evening when the little girl saw her mother writing at the kitchen table and asked what she was doing, then took out her box of crayons and said she would make it pretty. Corinne had pinned the notice to the bulletin board 2 months earlier. In those 2 months, the small envelope fastened beneath it had collected an amount she never told anyone, enough to pay for a month of bus fare and buy a little extra food, nothing more. She had left the paper on the board, not because she still had hope, but because taking it down would have felt like admitting something she wasn't yet ready to admit. That Friday night, just as the room reached its loudest and the phone mounted on a tripod was pointed toward the center of the crowd, Brody Kessler walked past the entrance, stopped in front of the bulletin board, and tore the paper down. He held it up before the camera and turned it until it fit neatly inside the frame. "Look at this," he said. "Someone here is raising money." He read aloud the amount inside the envelope in the voice people use when setting up a joke, drawing out the final word, then pausing for exactly 1 beat as he waited, and the crowd laughed. Not everyone, but enough of them, and loudly enough. The laughter broke out and spread in the way people laugh because the person beside them is laughing, not because they truly understand what is happening. 2 whole months, Brody said, turning toward the camera as he patted the paper with one hand. 2 months. "Do you people know how long it takes me to make that much?" Someone whistled. Someone shouted his name. He smiled, satisfied, then released the paper. It fell, turning once in the air before landing in the puddle beside the edge of the mat that no one had cleaned since that afternoon. Corinne stood about 10 steps away, holding a mop. She had heard everything. For a moment, she remained still, her expression unchanged, and the only thing anyone could see was her fingers tightening around the wooden handle before slowly letting go. Then she walked forward. She didn't say anything to Brody. She didn't look at him. And she didn't look at the camera. She went straight to the puddle, set down the mop, and lowered herself onto one knee to pick up the paper. She knelt because the paper was on the floor, and because that patch of water was hers to clean. But the 200 people in that room saw a woman kneeling at the feet of a boy, and the entire room misunderstood. Someone burst out laughing again. Someone else said that was enough. Corinne lifted the paper with the tips of 2 fingers. It had soaked up the water and gone limp, her handwriting dissolving into pale blue stains. In the bottom corner, the heart drawn in red crayon lay half submerged in the water, and the red was slowly melting away, bleeding into a thin pink streak that spread across the black rubber floor. She looked at it. She didn't hurry to wipe it away. She remained there, resting on one knee, the wet paper in her hand, surrounded by the noise of 200 people. And at the far end of the room, Nick Farrow's mop stopped moving. He leaned it against the wall. Then he walked through the crowd, neither quickly nor slowly, and people moved aside to let him pass without understanding why they had done so. He stopped in front of Brody Kessler and spoke 6 words, no louder than necessary, yet clearly enough for the people in the back row to hear. "You owe this woman an apology." For 2 seconds, the entire room fell silent. Then Brody laughed. He laughed louder than everyone who had laughed before him, turned fully toward the camera, and raised both hands like an actor preparing for the main scene. "All right, old man," he said. "You last 3 minutes with me, and I'll apologize to her in front of everyone in this room, and I'll pay every dollar still missing from that paper of hers. But when you go down, you clean the place where you land." He held out his hand. "We'll do it live. Everyone's watching." Nick Farrow didn't shake his hand. He looked at the outstretched hand for exactly 1 beat, then turned away, and his refusal to accept it made the crowd roar even louder than when he had spoken those 6 words. He walked back to his cart, pulled the rubber gloves from his hands, turned each one right side out, folded them in half, and placed them neatly on the rim of the cart beside the spray bottle and roll of paper towels, in the same place where he left them every night before going to wash his hands. Then he took off his coat, folded it in half, and draped it over the arm of a chair. The gray work shirt underneath had the name Nick embroidered above the breast pocket, with the stitching frayed at one corner. He walked to the edge of the mat, sat down, and began untying his shoes. He did it slowly, one shoe at a time, loosening every row of laces from top to bottom, instead of yanking them free the way people do when they're in a hurry. Then he placed the shoes side by side beyond the edge of the mat, their toes pointing outward, perfectly aligned, in the way a man might arrange his shoes before entering someone else's home. Someone in the crowd gave a quiet laugh, but the laughter died almost immediately, and no one else joined in, because something in that noisy room had suddenly gone still, though no one could have named what it was. Corinne slipped past two people blocking her way, hurried forward, and grabbed his sleeve. "Don't," she said. Her voice was soft but urgent. "Listen to me. Don't." He stopped and looked up. "That kid broke a man's jaw right here last fall," she said. "They had to take him away in an ambulance. You don't have insurance." "I know you don't. None of the night shift workers here do. If he puts you down, who's going to pay your bills?" He didn't answer. She tightened her grip on his sleeve, and her voice broke in the middle of her next sentence. "I'm not worth anyone breaking a bone for me," she said. "Do you understand? I can take what just happened. I've been taking things like that for a long time. By tomorrow morning, everyone will have forgotten. Go home. Tomorrow night, we'll come back and work our shift like we always do, and we'll pretend none of this ever happened." Nick Farrow looked at her. He held her gaze longer than an ordinary man would look at a coworker from the night shift, and there was no anger in his eyes, nor was there pity. There was only a calmness that sent an unexpected chill down her spine. "This isn't about you anymore," he said. Then, very gently, he removed her hand from his sleeve and stepped onto the mat. Corinne took one step back. She stood there with her hand still loosely curled in the air where she had released him, and for one moment she didn't know what she was supposed to do. She had meant to walk straight out the door. She had thought that if she left, perhaps he would follow, but her feet wouldn't move, and when she looked up, he was already standing in the center of the mat, barefoot on the rubber surface, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his hands unclenched. She turned and walked back toward the counter, making her way through the crowd as people jostled one another for a better place to stand. Behind the counter was a small cabinet mounted on the wall, its door white and its paint yellowed with age. Corinne opened it, took down the first aid kit, and as she did, her hands trembled so badly that she dropped the lid. She picked it up, opened the kit, and checked what was inside in the way people inspect something they already know they'll soon have to use. There were bandages, there was gauze, there was a disposable cold pack. She squeezed it to break the inner pouch, felt it begin to grow cold in her hand, then placed it back inside the kit. Otis Grady stood a few steps away, watching her, and he didn't ask anything. He simply opened the small freezer beneath the counter, took out another bag of ice, and set it on top of the kit for her. Corinne carried the entire box back, threaded her way through the crowd once more, and placed it on the floor just beyond the edge of the mat, beside the work shoes arranged in a perfectly straight line. Then she stood. She didn't retreat behind the crowd. She remained right there, exactly one step from the edge of the mat, her arms folded across her chest, in the place where he would see her first whenever he looked down from the mat. People shoved behind her, and someone complained that she was blocking the view, but she didn't move. In the center of the mat, Brody Kessler was rolling his wrists, bouncing lightly on his feet, and smiling at the camera one last time. Otis stepped forward with a stopwatch in his hand, and he looked at Nick Farrow for a very long moment before raising his arm. Otis lowered his hand, and the quality of the noise in the room changed at once, from the sound of a crowd waiting to the sound of a crowd that had just been unleashed. Brody Kessler didn't bother testing him. He didn't need to. He came forward in 3 long strides and began pressing the attack, his hands moving without pause, his feet dragging across the rubber mat with the short, urgent squeak anyone who had ever stood inside a gym would recognize. Nick Farrow didn't dodge with grace. There was no fluid turn, no deft slip of the shoulder to make the crowd roar. He lowered his shoulders, tightened his neck, brought both arms in to shield his head and chest, and absorbed the blows. There came a succession of impacts, dull and dry, the sound of fabric scraping against fabric. the sound of Brody's breath forcing its way through his teeth in perfectly even bursts. The crowd screamed. Someone shouted Brody's name. Someone slapped a hand against the side of a chair. And amid all that noise, Corinne stood at the edge of the mat with her arms still folded across her chest, her fingertips digging into her elbows until they turned white. She heard a woman standing nearby draw a sharp breath and hold it, and then realized that she was holding her own breath too. Nick retreated. He moved backward in short steps, keeping his feet evenly spaced, and with every step, he shifted slightly to one side. Not much, just enough to keep from being driven into a corner. But he was still retreating, and to the 200 people watching, retreating meant losing. He was truly in pain. It was the one thing no one in the crowd could see, and the only thing he couldn't hide from himself. He was past 30. His left knee, which had been locked in a brace for an entire summer when he wrestled in school, now sent a small, deep stab of pain through him every time he shifted his weight. His back was stiff from spending the entire week sitting in cars and behind desks, the stiffness of a man who hadn't needed to move quickly in a very long time. 30 seconds passed, and sweat had already soaked the back of his gray work shirt. Someone behind him shouted for the old man to lie down already. Laughter followed. Otis Grady stood at the edge of the mat, his eyes fixed on the stopwatch in his hand, and he could see that his hand was trembling. Corinne closed her eyes for one beat, then opened them again at once, because closing them was worse. Then Brody changed his approach. He saw that the man before him knew only how to cover himself and retreat. He saw that the crowd was on his side, and he decided to end the spectacle in a way that would look good. He dropped low and shot forward for the man's legs, fast and straight, with perfect form, the kind of move he had practiced thousands of times in his training room and had never once missed. Nick Farrow didn't drop his weight to resist. He didn't push, didn't deflect, and didn't make any movement the crowd had time to recognize. He merely shifted his rear foot a very small distance, less than the width of a hand, and turned his hips with the motion. That was all. But that tiny shift changed the angle between them completely, and Brody, already driving forward with all his momentum, crashed into the exact place where a man had been standing 1 second earlier. His arms closed around empty air. A body struck the mat with a heavy, abrupt thud, followed immediately by the sound of breath being driven from Brody's chest in a noise that wasn't quite a word. The crowd froze. Someone who had been halfway through a shout fell silent. The phone mounted on the tripod was still recording, but the person holding the tripod had stopped adjusting the frame. Nick didn't rush after him. He didn't leap onto Brody's back, didn't pin him down, and didn't do anything that everyone in the room knew would have been entirely legal and entirely easy at that moment. He stepped back twice, moved beyond Brody's reach, let his hands hang loosely at his sides, and waited. He waited for Brody Kessler to push himself up. He waited for him to rise onto one knee, then stand, then turn to face him again. For the first time that evening, the entire room was silent. It wasn't the silence of people waiting to see what would happen next. It was the silence of 200 people who had all realized at once that they had misread something from the very beginning and were now trying to read it again. The cameraman lowered the camera all the way to his waist. In that silence, Corinne could hear her own breathing clearly. She looked down at the first aid kit by her feet, then raised her eyes. On the mat, the man who had worked the night shift beside her for 3 months was standing there, waiting for his opponent to rise, his face betraying nothing at all, and for the first time in her life, she was afraid of him. Brody Kessler got to his feet, and his face had changed. He was no longer smiling, no longer glancing toward the camera, no longer shrugging like a man performing for a crowd. He caught the wrap around his wrist between his teeth, pulled it tight, and when he moved forward this time, he didn't approach the way he had before. He drew himself in, lowered his elbows close to his ribs, and advanced very slowly. You can learn a great deal about a fighter from the way he responds after being taken down for the first time. And what Brody had just learned was that he couldn't charge straight in, so he didn't charge straight in again. He applied pressure. He forced Nick Farrow gradually toward the edge of the mat, one step at a time, never hurrying, cutting off every path to the side that had saved the other man moments earlier. The sound of his shoes dragging across the rubber was shorter now, closer together, as steady as someone beating out a rhythm. Then he closed the distance, wrapped an arm around the back of Nick's neck, forced his head down, and pulled their bodies together until there was no space left between them for either man to strike. The crowd erupted. This was something they understood. This looked like a fight. Nick didn't struggle to break free. He didn't try to pull Brody's arm from the back of his neck, didn't retreat, and didn't turn. And to those watching, it was yet another sign that he had run out of options. Then Brody drove up his knee. The first strike glanced off the outside and caught only Nick's arm. The second landed cleanly. It struck the exact place that had once been broken many years earlier, in another backyard, in another life, and had healed crooked, the place that still ached whenever the weather changed. Though he had never told anyone, something inside his chest seemed to shut off. His breath failed for one beat. Then the next breath wouldn't come either, and in that brief emptiness, the entire room seemed to draw away from him and blur around the edges. He could hear the crowd, but it sounded as though he were listening through water. He watched the ceiling lights split into two overlapping circles before merging into one again. His left knee dipped by the width of a knuckle, then held. The crowd roared. People shouted Brody's name, pounded their fists against the sides of chairs, and someone screamed that it was over. It was over. The phone on the tripod was lifted again. Otis Grady stepped forward half a pace, his hand tightening around the stopwatch, his eyes moving from the man on the mat to the face of the watch, then back again. He stood there with the expression of someone about to do something he knew he would regret, whether he did it or not. More than a minute remained. At the edge of the mat, Corinne unfolded her arms. She had stood there from the beginning without making a sound, and even she didn't know she was about to cry out until the sound had already left her. "Nick!" She called the name embroidered above his pocket, the only name she knew, the name she had spoken hundreds of times over the past 3 months, in empty hallways at 2 o'clock in the morning, whenever she needed someone to hold a bucket for her, or when the vending machine swallowed her change. She called that name with everything left in her throat, and in the entire room, only one person heard it clearly amid the shouting of 200 others. Nick Farrow heard her. He didn't turn around. He couldn't turn around. But something in his stance changed. He planted his rear foot more firmly. He couldn't recover his breath, but he stopped trying, and instead began breathing shallowly, drawing in very short breaths through his nose, the way a man breathes when he knows exactly where he is being compressed and how much longer he has to endure it. Brody dragged his head even lower and prepared to drive his knee up for the third time, and in that moment, inside a mind ringing from lack of air, the man being held down on the mat suddenly realized something with perfect clarity, so clear that it cut through all the noise. He had been in this position before. He had known exactly what to do many years ago, and he had shut that part of himself down with his own hands on the day he stood inside a church and watched them lower his brother's coffin into the earth. It hadn't disappeared. It had only been lying there, asleep, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake it. The third knee strike never came. Nick Farrow didn't struggle to break free, didn't push, and didn't do what anyone would normally do when his head was being held down. He did the opposite. He stepped inward, moving even closer, so close that Brody no longer had room to build momentum, and at the same time he dropped his center of gravity much lower, settling his full weight through his bare feet into the rubber mat. Someone in the crowd gave a short cry. Brody was still holding the back of his neck, but that hold worked only when the man being held wanted to escape. Nick didn't want to escape. He threaded one arm through the inside, touched Brody's elbow from beneath, and lifted, not with force, only in the right direction. The entire structure Brody had built with his arms collapsed in less than a second, and the instant he lost his support, Nick turned his hips, drew him along the path of his own falling momentum, and brought him down to the mat. There were no punches, not one. The sound of both bodies landing was a low, drawn-out thud, and after that, there was only breathing. Nick held him there. He didn't press down on his face, didn't choke him, and didn't do any of the things the 200 people in that room were waiting to see. He simply slipped one arm beneath Brody's shoulder, locked the hold, placed his weight across his chest, and remained still. Brody thrashed. He fought with his entire body, kicking both legs, trying to turn his hips, trying to roll free, and each time he struggled, the hold tightened a little more, not because the man restraining him was applying greater force, but because Brody was pulling himself deeper into it. The crowd fell silent for the second time. Otis Grady stood rooted to the floor, forgetting even to press the stopwatch in his hand. Corinne took half a step forward, then stopped. On the mat, Nick Farrow lowered his head, leaned close to his opponent's ear, and spoke a single sentence, quiet enough that only the two of them could hear it, yet clear enough that Brody would remember it for the rest of his life. "You didn't lose because I'm stronger. You lost because you thought there were people in this world who didn't know pain. Brody struggled once more weakly this time. Then he raised one hand and slapped the mat 3 times, short, quick, and decisive. Nick released him immediately. He didn't hesitate for a beat or hold on for another half-second to display his power. He rolled to the side, braced one hand against the mat, and stood. Then he did the one thing none of the 200 people in that room had expected. He turned back, bent down, and extended a hand to the man he had just defeated. Brody lay there staring at that hand. He stared at it longer than necessary, his chest still rising and falling heavily. And in that moment, nothing remained on his face of the man who had laughed before the camera only minutes earlier. Then he took it. Nick pulled him to his feet, steadied him by the shoulder until he could stand on his own, then let go. The crowd remained silent. Nick Farrow said nothing about the money. He didn't look toward the envelope, and he didn't look toward the sponsor standing frozen beside the door. He only spoke in a voice made hoarse by the lack of air, the words broken into 2 short phrases. "You still owe one more thing. Pay it." Brody turned his head. He saw the woman standing at the edge of the mat, her arms hanging at her sides. Her hair loosened over one shoulder. He walked toward her, and each of those steps felt longer than all 3 minutes on the mat put together. He stopped in front of her. His throat was so raw that he had to swallow before he could speak, and when he did, he spoke loudly enough for the people in the last row to hear, because he understood that if he said it quietly, the debt wouldn't truly be paid. "I'm sorry. For the paper. For what I said. I was wrong." Corinne looked at him. She didn't say a word. She merely nodded. One very small nod. The kind people offer a stranger who has picked up a glove they dropped in the street. Then she turned away. And it was that nod, not the 3 minutes on the mat, that left Brody Kessler standing motionless in the middle of the room, like a man who had just lost something he didn't know how to name. Because she wasn't angry with him, nor did she forgive him. She simply needed nothing from him at all. Corinne bent down and picked up the first aid kit. She stepped over the edge of the mat and walked to where Nick Farrow stood, with one hand resting lightly against his ribs. She pulled his hand away, placed the cold pack directly over that spot, then pressed his hand back on top of it. He shuddered faintly. "Sit down," she said, and he sat. He had been sitting for perhaps 20 breaths when the front door flew open. It opened with such force that the cheap wind chime someone had hung from the frame so long ago rattled wildly, and a long rush of cold air swept in from the street and crossed the floor. An older man entered first, wearing a long wool coat, no hat, his silver hair combed back, and he walked straight into the center of the room with the manner of someone who had never once in his life needed permission to pass through a door. 2 other men followed behind him, younger and silent. They stopped exactly 2 steps behind him and came no farther. The crowd parted. No one had to say a word. People simply stepped back, drew in their shoulders, and opened a path through the middle of the room. And within seconds, the crowd that had been roaring only moments before grew as quiet as a classroom after the principal walks through the door. Corinne, kneeling on one knee beside Nick's chair, looked up. She didn't know who the man was, but she saw the face of the man standing near the entrance, the one in the expensive coat who accompanied Brody Kessler every time he came there, the man Otis always called the sponsor. His face had gone white. Not white with surprise. White in the way a man's face turns when he suddenly realizes he is standing somewhere he should never have been. The silver-haired man stopped in the center of the room and looked around once. He saw the cleaning cart standing in the corner, the work shoes arranged in a straight line beyond the edge of the mat, and the man in the gray work shirt sitting on a plastic chair with a cold pack pressed against his ribs. Something passed briefly across his face. Then he spoke, without lowering his voice at all. "Mr. Ferrante." Those 2 words fell into the room and remained there. Someone turned to look at the person beside him. Someone else frowned, not yet understanding. But near the door, the sponsor lifted one hand to his mouth, then lowered it again, and that meaningless gesture said more than all the other faces in the room combined. Corinne turned toward the man sitting beside her. He didn't look at her. He was watching the older man with silver hair, and he let out one long breath, the breath of someone finally setting down something he had carried for 3 months. Then he braced a hand against his thigh and stood. He rose a little slowly because of his ribs, but once he was upright, his entire bearing changed, and anyone with a careful eye would have understood that the man who had just been sitting in that plastic chair was no longer the man who cleaned the floors, even though that name was still embroidered above his pocket. He looked toward the entrance. "Mr. Whitlock," he said. The sponsor flinched when he heard his own name. "The leases on all 3 facilities you're renting, including this one," Nico said, his voice as calm as when he had asked Corinne how to remove tar from a rubber floor, "are held by my company. All 3 are approaching their expiration dates. I won't renew them." Whitlock opened his mouth. He meant to say something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a question. Nico didn't wait. "You may continue using them for the remainder of the lease period, exactly as the contracts allow, without losing a single day. My people will send written notice on Monday morning." There was no threat in those words. No one had been singled out with an accusing finger. No name had been spoken as a warning. There was nothing any lawyer could produce as evidence of anything. It was simply an owner's right over his own property, stated in the tone someone might use to comment on the weather. And that was precisely why the entire room grew cold. Whitlock stepped back half a pace, struck a chair, then collapsed into it without ever intending to sit. Nico turned away. His gaze traveled across the crowd, over faces trying to look at him without daring to meet his eyes directly, and came to rest on the front desk. Otis Grady was still standing exactly where he had been, the stopwatch clenched in one hand and a cleaning cloth draped over his shoulder. The 2 men looked at each other across the entire room. Otis didn't lower his face. He stood straight and accepted the full weight of that gaze, because he knew exactly what he had witnessed and exactly what he had done. 3 times he had sat before the screen. 3 times he had pressed send. Nico Ferrante watched him for a very long time, and there wasn't a trace of blame in his eyes. Only a single question he had not yet spoken aloud. Then where had everything Otis had written gone? Corinne was still kneeling on one knee beside the plastic chair, the first aid kit lying open on the floor, and she was trying to understand what the name Ferrante meant. It meant nothing to her. She had never heard that name in her life. Not on television, not in the newspapers, not on any document she had ever been required to sign. So in that moment, all she felt was confusion. And before that confusion could even take shape, the silver-haired man spoke again. He addressed the 2 men standing behind him, lowering his voice from before, and said only a few words, something about waiting outside and keeping the door closed. When he finished, he turned toward Nico and added one more sentence, this time in a warmer voice, almost tender. "Sit down. Let me call someone." And Corinne dropped the lid of the first aid kit from her hand. It fell onto the rubber floor without making much noise, but she didn't pick it up. She didn't look at the man's face. She didn't need to. That voice had traveled straight through 3 years and lodged itself in the center of her chest like a needle she had thought she pulled out long ago. She knew that voice. She knew it better than she knew the voice of her own mother. 3 years earlier, only days after she buried Danny, while she was still wearing the same coat she had worn to the cemetery because the thought of changing her clothes hadn't even occurred to her, someone called her to an office building in Center City. She remembered the elevator with mirrors on all 4 walls and how she hadn't dared to look into any of them. She remembered the conference room with a table far longer than it needed to be, and she remembered being invited to sit alone in the middle of one side. 3 people sat across from her. 2 younger men in suits occupied either end and didn't speak throughout the entire meeting. The person in the middle was an older man, and he was the only one who opened his mouth. She couldn't remember his face. Later, she had tried to remember it night after night, but she could never reconstruct his features, because that day everything had been blurred before her eyes, and she had spent the entire meeting staring down at the table. But she never forgot the voice. It was warm. That was the worst part. It was warm and slow. It called her my dear. It told her how sorry he was, that he had a son around her husband's age, that he understood she couldn't bring herself to care about anything now, but that life was long, and she still had a little girl to raise. He spoke for 10 minutes. In all those 10 minutes, he didn't tell a single lie, and that was precisely what made it so skillful. Then he pushed a check and a document across the table. He told her to sign and be done with it so she could go home to her little girl, because lawsuits that dragged on for years never brought anything good to anyone. Corinne signed. She didn't read a single line. She remembered her hand trembling so badly that her signature came out crooked, and she remembered apologizing for her poor handwriting, and she remembered the man smiling kindly and telling her it was all right, my dear. Later, when the fog began to lift, and she started to understand what that document had been, she called the number printed on the business card. No one answered. She went back to the building, and they told her that department had moved. She asked for the name of the man who had met with her, and no one knew whom she was talking about. The only thing she remembered was the company name printed at the top of the document, Keystone Structural, and that name later vanished from every place she searched. Now, inside a gym in South Philadelphia, surrounded by 200 people standing in bewilderment without understanding what had just happened, that same voice had told someone to sit down and let him call for help. Corinne rose. She stood so quickly that she struck the plastic chair and knocked it sideways. Someone called her name. She didn't hear. She pushed through the crowd without moving around anyone, colliding with 2 or 3 shoulders along the way, shoved open the glass door at the side entrance, and stepped outside. The cold struck her face like a slap. She made it 3 steps across the concrete landing before her legs gave way, and she dropped down right there in the open air without her coat. Both hands clutched the edge of the step, all 10 fingertips grinding into the rough concrete until her skin went numb from cold and pain. She continued gripping it, her shoulders jerking in short, silent waves, her breath leaving her in broken white clouds that scattered into the air. 3 years. For 3 years, she hadn't found a single name, a single face, or a single door she could knock on. And tonight, that man had passed within a few steps of her without even knowing who she was. He found her in the parking lot behind the building, beneath the only light pole still burning. She had risen from the steps and made her way out there, where she stood with her back against the side of a truck that didn't belong to her, her hands wrapped around her elbows. She heard his footsteps from a distance, but didn't turn. Nico stopped a few paces away. He was still wearing the gray work shirt beneath his outer coat, and he walked with a slight tilt because of his ribs. "You should go back inside," he said. "It's cold out here." Corinne turned around. Her face was dry, without a single tear, and it was that dryness that made him falter. "Who is that old man?" she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer immediately. "I asked who he is." "Aldo Marchetti," he said. "He works for me." Corinne nodded slowly, as though she were fitting a piece into its proper place and didn't like the picture beginning to emerge. "And who are you?" He was silent for 1 beat. "Nico Ferrante." "Not Nick Farrow." "No." "You aren't a man who cleans floors." "No." "For the past 3 months." "For the past 3 months," he repeated. She gave a short laugh that held no amusement at all. Then she stepped forward, stopped directly in front of him, and said the one thing he wasn't prepared to hear. 3 years ago, that old man sat across from me in a conference room. He gave me a document, and I signed it. I had buried my husband only a few days earlier. I didn't read a single word. Nico stood motionless. "My husband's name was Danny Bishop," she said. "He was an iron worker. He fell at a construction site. The company was called Keystone Structural, and for 3 years, I've searched everywhere for that name without finding it anywhere. Have you ever heard of it?" He could have said no. He could have said that his company had dozens of branches, and that he couldn't possibly remember the name of every one of them, and it would have been the truth. But he said nothing of the kind. "No," he answered. Corinne watched him for another moment. Then she walked around him toward the bus stop, and he didn't try to stop her. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He didn't say a word about the unsigned letter or the 9 names he couldn't prove, because at that moment he wasn't certain of anything, and he had learned long ago that the worst thing anyone could offer a woman who had already been deceived once was another promise. He didn't go home that night. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, he called his personal attorney, woke him from sleep, and made only one demand. Find Keystone Structural, trace it from the bottom all the way to the top, search through every layer of parent companies, and identify the name at the highest level. 4 hours later, the attorney called back. He spoke briefly, his voice cautious, like a man who knew he was about to ruin someone's morning. Keystone Structural had been a small subsidiary that was now dissolved. It had once worked as a subcontractor on civil construction projects east of the river. It sat beneath an intermediary company, and that intermediary company belonged to Ferrante Holdings. It had been there during his brother's time. It was still there on the day Danny Bishop fell, on a drizzly April morning when he climbed to the 4th level of a scaffold and the platform beneath him failed to hold. He died before the ambulance arrived. The report blamed the worker for failing to follow procedure. No inspector pursued the matter. There was no lawsuit. The case was closed in less than 2 weeks. Nico told the attorney to send him copies of everything immediately. He read the documents inside the car beneath the overhead light, in the exact place where he sat every night before beginning his shift. He read the report. He read the compensation terms. He read the settlement agreement, bearing the signature of a woman named Corinne Bishop, the handwriting crooked and trembling, leaning sharply to the right, as though the person writing it had been trying to finish as quickly as possible. Then he turned to the final page, the page bearing the signature of the other party, the representative who had signed on behalf of the company. He stared at it. He didn't need to read the typed name below. He had known that handwriting all his life. He had seen it on birthday cards when he was a boy, on the backs of family photographs, on the note taped to his refrigerator, reminding him to take his medicine the year he broke his arm, and on hundreds of checks and contracts over the past 4 years. The handwriting leaned at an even angle. The first letter was written much larger than all the others, and the final stroke extended outward before curling back upward. Nico Ferrante sat in that car for a very long time, still holding the paper in his hand, while dawn began to break outside. Aldo Marchetti's house stood at the end of a row of attached homes in the Passyunk neighborhood, its kitchen window overlooking a backyard just large enough for a potted lemon tree that he had to wrap every winter. He opened the door at nearly 7 o'clock in the morning, still wearing the sweater he slept in, and when he saw Nico standing there with a stack of papers in his hand, he didn't ask anything. He simply stepped back and let him inside. They sat in the kitchen. Aldo placed the kettle on the stove out of habit, then turned it off again. Nico set the papers on the table, opened them to the final page, and turned it toward him. Aldo looked at the page for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes," he said. That was all. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask where Nico had found it. He didn't offer a single excuse about having signed only as an authorized representative, though he easily could have. "Did you know his name?" Nico asked. "Bishop," Aldo said. "Danny Bishop. You remember him. I remember everything." Outside, a garbage truck passed the house. Aldo reached out and straightened the tablecloth, a meaningless gesture, then lowered his hand. "If you want to hear it, I'll tell you," he said. "But I won't apologize to you. I have nothing to apologize for." Nico didn't respond. "When your brother died," Aldo began, then stopped to search for the words. "Sandro spent 11 days in the hospital. You sat in that hallway for all 11 of them. I sat beside you. Do you remember what you ate during those 11 days? Nothing. I had to buy sandwiches and place them in your hands as though I were feeding a child." He looked out the window. "The day they lowered him into the ground, you were 30 years old. 30 years old, and suddenly all those people were looking at you. Do you know how many men standing in that cemetery were calculating how long it would take you to collapse? I know. I stood behind you, and I counted every one of them." "What does any of that have to do with the ironworker?" Nico asked. "It has everything to do with him," Aldo said, and for the first time, his voice hardened. "That case landed on my desk in the 4th month after the funeral. The 4th month. If an inspector had come in then, they wouldn't have stopped at one scaffold. They would have opened everything. They would have turned over everything your brother left behind, and you didn't even know what your brother had left behind. You signed the papers, taking control before you could finish reading the inventory of assets. I opened the filing cabinet and found things I knew would send you to prison in place of a dead man if anyone dragged them into the light." He placed both hands on the table. "So I closed it. I paid the family. I put my name on the agreement, not yours, because I wouldn't let you be tied to it. And I didn't tell you, because if I had, you wouldn't have allowed me to do it." Nico remained silent for a long time. "And Otis Grady," he said. Aldo didn't ask what he meant. 3 times, he said. All 3. "Why?" "Because that kid had someone behind him, and the man behind him was renting 3 of our properties. Because for the past several months, you've been cleaning floors in that very place. And if I had allowed those reports to move any farther up, people would have gone down to investigate. They would have questioned the night shift workers, and your identity would have been exposed." He paused. "I kept all 3 reports in my drawer. I read every one of them. I knew he had written the truth." "Then why didn't you give them to me?" "Because you would have dealt with it that same night, and you would have exposed yourself." Aldo stopped. He meant to continue. His mouth opened, but no words came. He raised one hand to cover his mouth and held it there, and his shoulders trembled very faintly. The entire kitchen fell silent. "I carried you in my arms before you could walk," he finally said, his voice breaking in the middle. "Your father asked me to watch you at the gym on some afternoons. You sat on the bench with your feet dangling above the floor. Then your brother died, and I told myself that no matter what I had to do, I would make sure you were secure in that seat." He lowered his hand. I did it. You're secure now, but some woman somewhere had to pay the price for it. I know. I've known since the day I signed that paper. Nico stood. He said nothing. He picked up the stack of documents, walked out of the kitchen, and entered the narrow hallway connecting it to the front door. There, he stopped. Several old, framed photographs hung on the wall. One had been taken inside his father's gym. A little boy sat on a bench, his legs swinging without touching the floor, while a man, far younger than Aldo, was now stood behind him with one hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Nico Ferrante stood there for a very long time. He commanded 3 districts. Never in his life had he needed more than 10 seconds to know what he had to do next. But that morning, in the cramped hallway filled with the scent of coffee that hadn't yet been brewed, he stood looking at the photograph and didn't know what to do with the old man sitting in the room behind him. The live stream from that night didn't die when the broadcast ended. People cut it into short clips, gave them new titles, and by the middle of the week, it had traveled everywhere. But the part that spread farthest wasn't the 3 minutes on the mat. It was the beginning. The part showing a man in a gray work shirt pushing a mop across a rubber floor, with the name Ferrante written beneath him. In his world, no one talked about how he had won. They talked about the mop. Sal Renzo was the first to understand how he could use it. He had gone through the entire list as he promised. He had stood before Mrs. Aponte and confessed what he had done, and every shop he entered made something inside him twist a little tighter. Now he went back to each of the 4 men who had once sat around that table covered with a white cloth, then sought out others as well, and wherever he went, he planted the same single sentence. Once he had spoken it, he added nothing more. That kid isn't the boss anymore. He mops floors. The words were as light as a grass seed, and they took root quickly, because in that line of work, nothing frightened men more than following someone whom others had stopped fearing. Nico's phone began receiving calls he hadn't received in years. People asked about his health in a way that was meant only to hear whether his voice still sounded steady. 2 places postponed signing contracts, offering the end of the year as an excuse. Aldo could have put an end to it all within 3 days, and they both knew it, but Nico didn't call him, and Aldo didn't call Nico. The pressure arrived during the very week when he needed quiet more than at any other time in his life. On Wednesday night, Corinne sent him a message asking to meet. They sat in a small diner on Passyunk Avenue, the place where she worked the morning shift. It was closed at that hour, with only the kitchen lights still burning, and the owner sitting at the far end of the room counting money. Corinne placed an old phone on the table. One corner of the screen was cracked, and the back cover was held on with tape. She pushed it toward him. "It belonged to Danny," she said. "I've kept it for 3 years. I charge it once every month." Nico looked at the phone without touching it. "Open the messages," she said. "Scroll all the way to the bottom." He opened them. There was a series of outgoing messages to a number saved under the name Foreman. The first had been sent one afternoon, 2 days before that drizzly April morning. It said there was something wrong with the flooring on the 4th level, that Danny had tried bracing it with scrap wood but it hadn't helped, and that someone should come down and inspect it before the next crew went up. The second message had been sent the following evening. It was shorter and asked whether anyone was reading his messages. The third had been sent at 6:10 on the morning he died. It contained only a few words, saying that he was still going up that day, but he wanted it known that he had warned them again. There wasn't a single reply. Nico placed the phone on the table. "You've had this for 3 years, he said. "Why didn't you give it to a lawyer?" "I did," Corinne said. "I gave it to 2 of them. The first told me that I had already signed the agreement, and if I sued now, I would be the one violating it, so they would have the right to sue me and demand the money back. I had already spent all of it on medicine and rent." The second listened to the story, then asked how much I had for an advance payment. She drew the phone a little closer to herself, as though afraid it might roll away. "So I put it away. I charge it once a month to keep it from dying completely. Some nights, I open it and read those 3 messages again. Then I turn it off and go to sleep, because I know there's nothing I can do." She raised her eyes to him. They were utterly dry, with the dryness of someone who had used up all her tears long ago. "Listen carefully," she said. "I didn't come here to ask you for money. I didn't come so you could pay my daughter's hospital bills. If you give me a check tonight, then you're exactly like that old man, except he was more polite than you." Nico said nothing. "I'm going to ask you one question," she said. "You can answer however you want, and I won't argue. But don't lie to me, Because I've already been lied to once, and I can't endure it a second time. She placed one finger against the cracked glass of the phone. Do you have the courage to bring this into the light? Truly bring it out. Into court, into the newspapers, into everything. Even if it doesn't bury only that old man. Even if it buries you too. Nico didn't answer that question in the diner. He sat in silence for a long time, then said he needed 2 days, and Corinne nodded, rose, and went home, leaving the phone on the table. She didn't ask what he needed those 2 days to do. The next morning, he called his attorney to the office at 7 o'clock. The man arrived, sat down, and for 2 hours did his utmost to perform the very task he was paid to perform. He said the agreement from 3 years earlier, though questionable in the way it had been obtained, was still legally binding. He said the messages were strong evidence, but they proved only one thing, and if the matter was opened, the investigators wouldn't stop at one thing. He said that once inspectors entered Ferrante Holdings with one name in their hands, they would leave with 30 more, and among those names were some that no one still living could explain. He said Nico would lose the company. He said Nico might lose far more than the company. Nico listened to everything without interrupting once, and when the attorney fell silent, he opened a drawer, removed the file concerning the 9 names already fastened together with complete copies of the Keystone structural case, placed it on the desk, and set the phone with the cracked screen on top. Take all of it, he said. The attorney looked at the stack of papers. Think about this for a few more days. No. You understand that I'll have to submit this. I understand, including the document bearing Mr. Marchetti's signature. Nico pushed the file a little farther toward him. Including that. The attorney remained seated for another moment, then gathered the documents, placed them inside his briefcase, closed the locks, and left without saying another word. That afternoon, Nico went to the hospital. He didn't call ahead and didn't ask anyone to make an introduction. He simply approached the front desk, asked which floor housed the financial department, and went upstairs. The woman behind the desk listened as he explained, entered the patient's name into the computer, and said the surgical slot was still being held, but only until the deadline recorded in the file. He asked what was required to secure the unpaid portion. She said they needed a financial guarantee letter certified by a bank, then added, in the voice of someone who had repeated the same sentence many times, that such a letter usually took 1 to 2 weeks. Nico asked whether she had a standard form. She looked at him, then printed one. He called the bank from the hallway and sat on the very same row of connected blue plastic chairs where Corinne had sat for so long several weeks earlier. By the end of the afternoon, someone from the bank had brought the documents directly to the hospital. He signed them. He didn't sign the name Nick Farrow. He signed the name his mother had given him, slowly and clearly, and in the space for the guarantor, he entered his own name instead of the name of any company, because he didn't want that payment recorded in the same books as the things that were about to be brought into the light. The woman in the financial department read the letter again, stamped it, and said the surgery would remain on the schedule, the slot wouldn't be given to anyone else, and she would call the family the following morning. He thanked her, took his copy, and left. In the parking lot, he sat inside the car for a very long time without starting the engine. He didn't call Corinne. He considered it, even picked up his phone, then set it down again, because he knew that calling her would turn the act into a declaration of what he had done, and he had no right to claim credit from that woman for anything. So he let the hospital call. The following morning, Corinne received the call while carrying a tray at the diner. She listened to everything, thanked the caller in an ordinary voice, ended the call, set down the tray, then went into the employee restroom and stood there for a long time with both hands braced against the sink. When she emerged, the owner asked whether something was wrong. Corinne said everything was fine, then went back to serve table 4. That evening, she came home earlier than usual. Maisie was sitting at the kitchen table coloring, and the little girl asked why her mother was home so early. Corinne said the diner hadn't been busy that day. She sat beside her daughter, picked up a crayon, and colored the sky above the roof for her, filling the entire corner of the page and taking far longer than necessary. At that same moment, on the other side of the city, Nico Ferrante's attorney entered a government building with his briefcase in hand and sat down to wait. The hallway was painted cream, with rows of connected plastic chairs lining both sides, and on the wall opposite Corinne hung a round clock with a white plastic rim, the kind of clock every hospital in the world seemed to use, its second hand moving forward one small tick at a time, instead of sweeping smoothly around the face. Corinne sat in the third chair from the end of the row. She had arrived while it was still dark, and she had been sitting there ever since the door at the far end of the hallway closed behind the rolling bed, after she bent down to kiss her daughter's forehead and heard the little girl remind her to bring the book about the cat because she wanted to finish reading it. Mrs. Halloran sat beside her, taking up 2 entire seats because she had brought a large cloth bag filled with all kinds of things, and she didn't say much. She simply sat there. Every so often, she took something from the bag, a bottle of water, a package of cookies, and placed it on Corinne's lap, only to put it away again when she saw that Corinne wouldn't touch it. Corinne sat perfectly straight. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers woven together, and anyone looking at her might have thought she was calm, until they looked more closely and saw that her fingertips had turned white from the pressure of her grip. The backs of those hands and the knuckles were cracked, with several old scratches that hadn't completely healed, and her nails were cut down close to the flesh, because long nails got in the way when she wore gloves. Those were the hands that had carried trays from 6 o'clock in the morning and held a mop until 4 o'clock in the morning. The hands that had counted loose change on the kitchen table on more nights than she had slept a full night. The hands that had written a crooked signature on a document she hadn't read. Now those 2 hands were locked together and didn't know what else to do. The second hand moved forward 1 tick at a time. Sometimes Corinne looked at the clock and saw it pointing to one place, then looked away for what felt like a very long time, only to glance back and find it still almost exactly where it had been. People passed in front of her. An older man walked by carrying a sleeping child. 2 nurses changing shifts greeted one another at the corner of the hallway. A voice over the speaker called someone's name to an upper floor. The hallway smelled of disinfectant mixed with coffee from the machine at the far end. Mrs. Halloran rose and returned with 2 cups. She placed one in Corinne's hand, and this time Corinne accepted it, but she didn't drink. She simply held it until it had gone completely cold in her hand. "Sit back against the chair," Mrs. Halloran said in the rough voice of someone who had given up smoking long ago. "You'll wear yourself out sitting so straight." Corinne didn't move. Mrs. Halloran watched her for a moment, then reached over, gently separated Corinne's tightly clasped hands, and took one of them into her own aged hand. She didn't say anything more. She simply held it, and every so often, she gave the back of Corinne's hand 2 gentle pats, the way old women pat one another's hands in church. Corinne let her. The warmth from the other hand passed into hers, and only then did she realize how cold her own hand had become. The second hand continued to tick. Sometimes she thought of many things all at once. She thought of the concrete steps outside the gym, the breakfast diner, the 3 messages no one had answered, and the way Danny used to rest his hand on the back of her neck while she stood washing dishes. Then there were moments when she couldn't think of anything at all. Her mind went completely empty, and she sat there counting with the sound of the clock without knowing what she was counting. The door at the far end of the hallway opened. Corinne heard it before she saw it, and she turned her head so quickly that Mrs. Halloran started. Someone stepped out, pulled down her mask, and walked toward them. The doctor stopped in front of the 2 women. Corinne tried to stand. She pressed her hands against the edge of the chair, pushed herself upward, and her legs refused to obey. She dropped heavily back into the seat. "Stay seated," the doctor said. Then she sat in the empty chair beside her, bringing herself level with Corinne's eyes, and continued in the slow, clear voice of someone who knew the person before her would remember every word. "Everything is all right. All of it. She made it through, and everything went exactly as we hoped. You'll be able to go in and see her shortly." Corinne nodded. She nodded once, then a second time, and then she couldn't nod anymore. Something inside her chest broke open, not into a loud sob, but into the sudden collapse of her shoulders, as her entire body folded forward, and both hands covered her face. Mrs. Halloran wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The doctor remained seated beside them, neither hurrying her nor rising to leave, and Corinne Bishop sat in that plastic chair in the hospital hallway for a very long time, unable to stand, weeping the tears she had held back for 3 long years. The call came on an afternoon in early summer, while Corinne was hanging laundry on the balcony. The number was unfamiliar, and the voice belonged to an older woman who spoke with a slight hesitation as she asked whether Corinne was Mr. Bishop's wife. She introduced herself as Roselle Vance. She said her husband was named Errol, that he had worked as an electrician and died many years earlier at a construction site across the river, and that the previous week, an attorney had called to tell her that her husband's case had been reopened. She was calling to say thank you. Corinne told her she had the wrong person, that she hadn't done anything at all. The other end of the line was silent for a moment. Then Roselle Vance explained that for years she had knocked on one door after another, but no one had listened, and in the end, she had done something even she thought was foolish. She found the office address of the company at the very top, sat down at her kitchen table, and wrote a single line on a scrap of paper. She didn't sign her name because she was afraid. She put it in an envelope, sealed it, and went to the post office to mail it. Then she returned home and stopped thinking about it, because she was certain that a scrap of paper like that would be thrown into the trash with all the other paperwork. Corinne stood frozen on the balcony with a clothespin in her hand. Mrs. Vance asked whether she was still there. Corinne said yes. She was still listening. The case continued throughout that entire summer. Ferrante Holdings was investigated from top to bottom. Its subsidiaries were separated and sold one after another, and the names buried in the records were gradually spoken aloud, one by one. Danny Bishop's messages were submitted as evidence. The agreement Corinne had signed 3 years earlier was declared invalid. Aldo Marchetti testified without concealing anything, and he left the courthouse that day in the afternoon rain with his hat held in his hand. Nico Ferrante was asked many questions, and he answered every one of them, including the ones his attorney had warned him not to answer. He lost the company. From the money remaining after the liquidation, a fund bearing Danny Bishop's name was established for the families of workers who had fallen at those construction sites, and the fund's small office was placed on the second floor of an old building on Passyunk Avenue. Roselle Vance was the first person to sign as a recipient. Brody Kessler never competed again. He rented part of a warehouse in the South District and began teaching afternoon martial arts classes to neighborhood children free of charge, and he didn't film a single class. That fall, Maisie returned to school. Corinne stood beside the schoolyard fence and watched her daughter chase several friends across the grass. The little girl ran a little more slowly than the others, but she ran, and she laughed so hard that both her eyes squeezed shut, exactly as they had in the old photograph with curling edges once taped to the inside of the cleaning cart. At 2 o'clock in the morning on an October night at Ironworks, the nameplate on the office door now read Corinne Bishop, night shift manager, and inside her desk drawer was a notebook filled with notes from her morning classes at the community college. She made her inspection round as she did every night, switched off some of the lights in the weights area, and stopped when she passed the space near the mat. A cleaning cart stood there, the spray bottle and roll of paper towels arranged in their familiar places, with a pair of rubber gloves folded in half on the rim. A man was bent over, wiping up a puddle someone had spilled that afternoon. He was thinner than before. He raised his eyes to her, then lowered them and continued cleaning. Neither of them mentioned what had happened. She didn't ask how he had been living since the trial, and she didn't ask about the people still searching for him outside, the ones who hadn't forgotten and wouldn't forget for a very long time. She simply went to the storage room, took out a second mop, returned, and began finishing the other side. The two of them worked in silence until nearly dawn. Some stories don't end with a miracle. They end with people choosing to rise and continue doing the work that remains before them. This life rarely rewards decent people at the moment they deserve it. But a person's dignity has never rested in the work they do or the amount of money in their pocket. It rests in the way they treat the person standing lower than they are. And sometimes, the thing that changes the lives of many families begins with an unknown woman sitting at her kitchen table, writing a single line she doesn't believe anyone will ever read. Never believe that your voice is too small. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so you can hear more meaningful stories every day. Please leave a few words in the comments below and tell us how you feel about tonight's story, about Corinne, and about the man in the gray work shirt, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your heart. May you always have abundant health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.